3 days before my son's engagement party, I drove to Maple Creek Bakery to pick up the custom cake I'd ordered 6 weeks earlier. Margaret Okafor had been baking for our family since my son was 7 years old. She made his birthday cakes every year until he left for university in Toronto. When he called to tell me he was getting engaged, the first thing I did after hanging up was phone Margaret. She answered on the second ring. "I need a cake," I told her. "A big one." She laughed and said she already knew it would happen someday. That Thursday afternoon, I pushed open the bakery door and the bell chimed the same way it had for 23 years. The smell of brown butter and cardamom hit me before I was fully inside. Margaret was behind the counter, and the moment she saw me, something changed in her face. Not dramatically, just a tightening around the eyes that I recognized because I'd known her long enough to notice. "Is everything all right?" I asked. She looked toward the front window, then at the young woman restocking pastries near the far wall. Margaret tilted her head toward the kitchen. "Come back here a moment, Dorothy. I need to show you something with the design." I followed her through the swinging door. She didn't stop at the decorating table. She kept walking until we were at the back corner near the walk-in refrigerator, and she turned off the overhead light so only the small utility lamp above the sink was on. "Margaret, what?" She held up one finger. "Listen." The wall shared with the cafe next door was thin. I'd never noticed before. Voices came through it clearly. 2 people, a man and a woman, seated close to the shared wall. The man's voice first. Smooth, unhurried. "The notary appointment is Tuesday morning. She'll sign everything before the party Saturday. She won't even question it. It's framed as estate planning." A woman's voice. Younger, slightly breathless. "And if she does ask questions, tell her it's standard," he said. "Tell her you suggested it. She trusts you more than anyone." A pause. Then the woman again. "What about the Lakeview property?" The man's voice dropped lower, but the wall carried it perfectly. "Once the power of attorney transfers, we move on Lakeview first. That alone is worth $1.4 million. Combined with the investment accounts, we're looking at just under $3 million total. The assisted living placement follows within 60 days. Birchwood Gardens. Very private. Very quiet." The name of the woman's voice finally registered in my body before it registered in my mind. It was my daughter-in-law, Vanessa. And the man? I knew that voice. I had heard it at my dining room table. I had shaken his hand at Christmas. It was Vanessa's brother, Curtis. Margaret's hand found my wrist in the dark and held it. I stood very still. I did not make a sound. I listened to my future daughter-in-law and her brother discuss the price of placing me in a care facility and what to do with the house my husband built. The voices shifted. Something about timing, about my son, about keeping him distracted. Then chairs scraped. Footsteps. The cafe door opened and closed. Silence. Margaret turned the light back on. Her eyes were wet. "Dorothy, I'm so sorry. They were here last week, too. Same table. Same conversation. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I'd misunderstood." "You didn't misunderstand," I said. My voice came out very flat. Not angry. Not shaking. Just flat. The way a voice sounds when the brain has not yet decided what the rest of the body is supposed to feel. "Can I still get the cake?" I asked. She stared at me. "What? The cake? For Saturday. I still want it." She disappeared into the refrigerator and came back with a white box tied in twine. I took it, looped the string over my fingers, and thanked her. "Dorothy, what are you going to do?" I looked at this woman who had known me for 2 decades, who had just saved me from walking into something I cannot describe. "I don't know yet," I said honestly, "but I'm going to find out exactly what I'm walking into before I walk into it." I carried the cake to my car and set it carefully on the passenger seat. Then I sat in the driver's seat with my hands on the wheel, and I didn't start the engine. $3 million. My husband Robert's name was still on the deed to that house. He built the porch with his own hands in 1991. He planted the white pine in the front yard the summer we brought our son home from the hospital. Robert died 4 years ago in November. Pancreatic cancer. 6 weeks from diagnosis to the end. Our son was devastated. I held them both through it. And now someone was planning to take the house Robert built and put me somewhere quiet where I wouldn't cause trouble. I started the engine. I pulled out of the parking lot onto the main road and drove home to Guelph under a flat gray Ontario sky. The Lakeview property was what we called the cottage, 2 hours north near Georgian Bay. Robert and I bought it in 2003. We spent every August there for 18 years. After Robert died, I kept paying the property taxes, kept the dock maintained, kept going every August alone because I wasn't ready to stop. My son came when he could. It was valued at $1.4 million at the last assessment. I hadn't thought of it as something to protect because I hadn't imagined anyone would try to take it. I sat at the kitchen table for an hour before I did anything. Then I opened my laptop. Power of Attorney, Elder Financial Abuse, Ontario. The results were familiar in the worst way. It happened constantly. It happened to people who were sharp, who were present, who had no warning. It happened through paperwork signed in haste, through trusted family members, through physicians willing to certify what wasn't true. I picked up my phone and called my solicitor. Paul Whitmore had handled our family's legal work for 15 years. Wills, the cottage purchase, Robert's estate. I had not spoken to him since we updated my will the previous spring. He answered on the third ring. "Paul," I said, "I need to see you tonight. It can't wait until Monday." A pause. His voice shifted. "Come at 7, he said. I dressed, fed the cat, and drove to his office on Willett Street. He met me at the door himself, his assistant long gone for the evening. I showed him what I knew. I told him about the voices through the bakery wall. I told him about the notary appointment on Tuesday, which was 4 days away. I told him about Birchwood Gardens and the 60-day timeline and Lakeview and the investment accounts. He listened without interrupting, which is why I trusted him for 15 years. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled up something on his computer. "Dorothy, has anyone asked you recently to sign anything? Anything described as routine or administrative?" I thought. In April, Vanessa had brought some papers to Sunday dinner. She said my son had suggested updating the beneficiary designations on my investment accounts. She'd already had them prepared. She had a pen ready. I'd skimmed them and signed because my son was standing in my kitchen smiling, and it was a Sunday and the roast was in the oven. I told Paul this. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. "Let me look at what was actually in those documents," he said quietly. He made a call. A contact at his firm who handled financial compliance. 40 minutes later, his printer produced 3 pages. Paul set them in front of me. He pointed to a clause on page 2. Secondary power of attorney for personal care activated upon certification of diminished capacity by a licensed physician or 2 adult family members acting jointly. "Vanessa and Curtis," I said. Paul nodded. "If they can get a physician to sign a capacity assessment, or if both of them file a joint family declaration, this activates immediately. Can we stop it?" "Yes, but we need to move before Tuesday's notary appointment. Emergency application to the Ontario Superior Court of Justice to freeze the designation changes and challenge the document. We also need an independent capacity assessment from a geriatrician of your choosing on the record before they can file anything. How long do we have?" "If the notary appointment is Tuesday morning, we have until Monday evening." Paul looked at me steadily. "Dorothy, is your son aware of any of this?" That was the question I had been sitting with since the bakery. "I don't know," I said. "He absorbed this. Do you think he's involved?" I thought about my son. I thought about the look on his face when his father died. I thought about how he had cried at Robert's grave, this grown man, this 41-year-old engineer, crying in a way I hadn't seen since he was 12. I thought about how much he loved Vanessa, how certain he was of her, how she had arrived in his life 3 years ago, and in 18 months they were engaged, and I had watched him become someone who deferred to her in ways that were small at first, and then not small. "I think he's being managed," I said, the same way I almost was. Paul reached into his desk drawer and slid a business card across to me. "Helen Marsh, former RCMP Financial Crimes. She consults on elder financial crimes. She consults on elder financial fraud. She's the best in the province. I picked up the card. Can we trust her? I've worked with her 6 times. She's thorough and she's fast, and she understands what's at stake for families in these situations. I stood and put my coat on. Paul walked me to the door. Dorothy, he said, if you expose this at the engagement party, there's no going back. Vanessa and your son, the wedding. I know, I said. The doors opened. I stepped out into the October night. I drove home in a kind of stillness that had nothing to do with calm. I made tea and sat at the kitchen table where Robert and I had eaten breakfast together for 31 years. The chair across from me was empty. It had been empty for 4 years. I looked at Helen Marsh's card. Then I dialed. 2 rings. Marsh. Her voice was direct and unhurried, the kind of voice that had heard difficult things and wasn't frightened by them. My name is Dorothy Callahan, I said. I need to hire you tonight. I have until Monday. We met at a Tim Hortons on the edge of town. She was 60, gray-haired, with sharp, dark eyes and a stillness that reminded me of Paul. She had a notebook. No phone on the table, no recorder. Just paper and a pen. Tell me everything, she said. I did. The bakery, the voices, Vanessa, Curtis, the April documents, the notary appointment, Lakeview, the assisted living placement, Birchwood Gardens, and the 60-day timeline. She wrote in clean, efficient lines. When I finished, she looked up. Your son. You said he might not know the full extent of this. That's what I believe, yes. Okay. She flipped a page. I need access. Financial records, background on Curtis Delacroix, information on the physician they may be planning to use for the capacity assessment. His name appeared in the voices at the cafe? No, but that's the piece I'll find. If they've done this before, there's a physician who's done it with them before. I'll start tonight. She paused. One more thing. How long have you known Vanessa? 3 years. She and my son met at a work conference in Calgary. Helen made a note. I'll verify her background. Fully. Calgary first, then before that. She pushed the notebook across the table. Her handwriting. Callahan Residence, Sunday 2 p.m. Bring your solicitor. What are you looking for? She looked at me steadily. 3 things. Each one worse than the last. I didn't sleep. I lay on my side of the bed and watched the ceiling change color as the hours passed. 3 things, each one worse than the last. At 5:30 a.m., my phone buzzed. Unknown number. Helen. Found the company. Norwood Property Holdings Incorporated in Alberta. Nominee directors. This goes beyond you. I sat up. My heart was loud in my chest. I stared at the message. Beyond me. How much worse could it get? Helen arrived at 2 p.m. Sunday. Paul was already in the living room. My neighbor Brenda Kaspruzak sat in the corner. She had lived next door for 27 years. She had been at Robert's funeral. She had brought soup every week for the first 2 months after he died. 2 nights ago, I had called her and told her I needed her to be present for something important, and she had said, I'll be there. No further questions required. Helen set a leather folder on the dining room table and opened it. She laid out 3 documents. She pointed to the first. Curtis Delacroix. Helen spoke without preamble. Before moving to Ontario 4 years ago, he was named in a civil action in British Columbia. An elderly woman, 78 years old, a retired school principal in Kelowna named Audrey Sinclair. Curtis was her financial advisor. Over 14 months, he redirected $340,000 from her registered accounts into a private holding company. When her nephew discovered the transfers, Curtis claimed they were authorized. There were documents. The signature was later found to be inconsistent with the woman's known handwriting. The civil case settled out of court. Records sealed. Curtis was never charged criminally. He relocated to Ontario within 6 months of the settlement. The room was silent. She pointed to the second document. Norwood Property Holdings, Incorporated in Alberta, March of this year. 2 directors, Curtis Delacroix and Vanessa Delacroix. I closed my eyes for 1 second. The cottage, Lakeview. $1.4 million. That was the first transfer earmarked in the conversation at the bakery. Paul leaned forward. What's the structure? Once the power of attorney activates, Helen continued, they transfer Lakeview to Norwood as a property acquisition. It gets listed, sold, and the proceeds go to the Norwood account. From there, it moves to an account in the Cayman Islands within 72 hours. The investment accounts follow through a separate mechanism once the personal care designation activates. How did you get this? Paul asked. She looked at him. Corporate registry searches are public. Financial intelligence takes longer, but Audrey Sinclair's nephew was willing to talk. He's been waiting for 3 years for someone to call? Third document. Helen's voice was careful now. I need to prepare you for this one. She set it down. A name. Dr. Gerald Foss, a physician in private practice in Waterloo. He's done this before, Helen said. Twice that I can confirm. She spread out 2 case summaries. The first. A man, 74, a retired electrician from Cambridge named Frank Owaled. Dr. Foss certified a cognitive decline assessment in 2021. Frank's son-in-law gained power of attorney. Frank's home was sold 9 months later. Frank was placed in a care facility in Brantford. He died in the spring of 2022. His daughter, who had been living in Vancouver, did not find out what had happened to her father's estate until after he died. She contacted the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario. The complaint was reviewed and closed for insufficient evidence. The second, a woman, 71, named Patricia Huang, a retired nurse from Kitchener. Dr. Foss filed a capacity assessment in 2022. Her son took control of her accounts. Her condo was listed within 90 days. Patricia's former colleague, a nurse named Sandra Webb, became suspicious and contacted Patricia's estranged daughter in Edmonton. The daughter flew in, retained a lawyer, and filed an emergency application. The case was partially unwound, but Patricia's savings were largely gone. Dr. Tricia's savings were largely gone. Foss received $50,000 from a numbered company linked to the son. The payment was flagged by Patricia's daughter's forensic accountant, but the criminal threshold for charges was not met. Dr. Foss still holds his license. Paul stood up. He walked to the window. Dorothy, Helen said. I believe, Doctor. Foss has already been contracted for your capacity assessment. I found a wire transfer from Norwood Holdings last month to a numbered company that traces back to an address connected to Foss's private billing. $80,000. I looked at the number. They paid him more than the others. Because my estate is larger. Yes, Helen said simply. I stood and walked to the window beside Paul. Outside, the white pine Robert planted was moving in the October wind. The yard was the same yard it had always been. The house was the same house. When Robert died, I had stood in that yard on a November morning and told him out loud that I would be all right. I had believed it. I turned back to the room. I need everything ready for Saturday, I said. Helen nodded, already prepared. Paul looked at me. Dorothy, if you do this at the party, your son's engagement ends in that room. His relationship with Vanessa, possibly with her family. His life as he understands it right now? I know, I said. Is there another way? I thought for a long time. And then I said, if I stop this quietly, Audrey Sinclair's money stays gone. Frank Owaled died in a care facility that shouldn't have held him. Patricia Huang lost her savings and she's still missing most of them. If I handle this privately, Dr. Traum. Foss keeps his license and finds the next elderly woman living alone with a cottage and a retirement account. No one spoke. I sat back down. Saturday, I said. Brenda spoke from her corner for the first time. I'll be there. The engagement party was on Saturday evening at a rented hall in downtown Guelph. One of those beautifully converted limestone buildings from the 1800s, exposed brick walls, string lights overhead, round tables with white tablecloths. My son had arranged it. He was good at arranging things. He'd been his father's son in that way. I arrived early. I wore a deep green wool dress I'd owned for a decade and had not let myself sell at the consignment shop because Robert always said it suited me. My son met me at the door. He hugged me and held on a moment longer than usual. You look beautiful, Mum. I smiled and held his face in my hands the way I had when he was small. my handsome boy. You did a wonderful job with this room, I told him. Your father would have loved it. His eyes went bright. He nodded and didn't trust himself to speak. Vanessa arrived 20 minutes later, composed, polished, wearing something ivory and expensive. She kissed my cheek and told me the centerpieces I had helped choose looked perfect. Her brother Curtis was with her in a dark suit, charm turned on at full wattage. He shook my hand and said he was looking forward to being part of the family. I smiled and said, "Likewise." At the far table near the back, I saw Helen, dressed simply, a glass of sparkling water in front of her. She gave me nothing, not even a nod. Good. Paul was 2 tables over. Brenna sat near the exit with 2 of her adult children who'd offered to come without being told why. At 8 o'clock, the woman my son had asked to MC stepped to the microphone. She was his colleague from the engineering firm, cheerful and organized. She tapped the glass and smiled. Before the evening's main festivities, she said, "We have a very special moment." She glanced at my son. "I believe the mother of the groom would like to say a few words." My son looked delighted. He didn't know I had a different speech. I stood and walked to the microphone. I looked out at the room. 60 people. My son's colleagues, old family friends, my sister Marlene, who had driven from Hamilton, neighbors, people who had known Robert, people who had watched my son grow up. I set my written remarks on the podium and did not look at them. "Good evening." My voice was even. "I am so grateful you're all here tonight to celebrate with us." I paused and looked at my son. When this boy was born, it was the coldest February Guelph had seen in 40 years. Robert drove me to the hospital in a blizzard. He drove 40 kilometers an hour the entire way and apologized the whole time as if the weather were his fault. Warm laughter moved through the room. My son smiled. When he was 7, he broke his arm falling out of the white pine in our front yard. He told me he was fine right up until he wasn't. He has always been someone who believes in people. He trusts easily and completely and without reservation. And for most of his life, that has been one of his greatest gifts. I paused. The room sensed something had shifted. "It is also," I said, "the thing that nearly cost us everything." The silence was immediate. I looked toward the AV setup at the back. A colleague of Helen's, standing quietly, pressed a button. A screen lowered behind me. My son stood up from his chair. "Mom, sit down, sweetheart, please." He looked at me. He sat. I turned back to the room. "I would like to share something with you tonight, because several people in this room deserve to know the truth, and because there are people beyond this room who have already been hurt and who deserve justice." The screen behind me lit up. A corporate registry document. Norwood Property Holdings, Inc. 2 directors listed. Curtis Delacroix, Vanessa Delacroix. Gasps, heads turning. My son's face going white as he read the names. Vanessa went still. Curtis reached for his jacket. Helen's colleague near the door was already moving. Curtis Delacroix, I said clearly, approached this family with a plan that began 3 years ago when his sister entered my son's life. The goal was simple: my home, my cottage on Georgian Bay, my retirement savings, approximately $3 million. The room erupted in whispers. I raised my hand and the room quieted. The screen changed. The civil claim from British Columbia. Audrey Sinclair, 78 years old. Kelowna, $1,340,000. Curtis targeted an elderly woman in Kelowna before coming to Ontario. Her name was Audrey Sinclair. She was a retired school principal. She trusted the person managing her money because that is what decent people do when they have no reason not to. I looked at Curtis directly. He was very still now. He relocated to Ontario after a civil settlement that was sealed and that therefore allowed him to begin again. He brought a plan and he brought his sister. My son was staring at Vanessa. His face was something I had not seen since he was a child standing beside his father's grave. The screen changed. The Norwood Holdings documents. The Alberta incorporation date. The wire transfer to the numbered company connected to Dr. Foss. This company was created to receive my assets once a power of attorney was activated. To activate it, they required a physician to certify that I was no longer mentally capable of managing my own affairs. I let that sit. The screen showed a name, Dr. Gerald Foss. Dr. Foss was paid $80,000 last month, I said, from a Norwood Holdings account to conduct that assessment. He has done this before. Twice that we have confirmed. The screen changed. Frank Ouellet, Patricia Huang. Their photographs, their ages, their names. Frank Ouellet was a retired electrician from Cambridge. He died in a care facility he should never have entered. Patricia Huang is a retired nurse from Kitchener. She lost the savings she spent her career building. My voice was steady. Patricia Huang is here tonight. I looked toward the table near the back. A woman stood. 71 years old, trim and upright, her eyes clear and direct. My name is Patricia Huang, she said. Everything Dorothy has described happened to me. I am standing here because Dorothy's solicitor called my daughter last week and because I will not allow this to happen to someone else while I can still stand up and say so. She sat down. The room was very quiet. Several people were crying. A woman at the back had her hand over her mouth. My sister Marlene was gripping the edge of the table. My son hadn't moved. He was staring at Vanessa with an expression I recognized because I had worn it myself in a bakery less than a week ago. I turned back to the microphone. The power of attorney documents I signed in April were misrepresented to me. I was told they were beneficiary updates. They contained a secondary clause allowing Vanessa and her brother to jointly declare diminished capacity and activate full control of my estate. The notary appointment to finalize the remaining transfer was scheduled for Tuesday morning. I glanced at my watch. The emergency application to the Ontario Superior Court of Justice was filed this morning. All accounts are frozen. The Lakeview property transfer is blocked. The screen behind me changed. Bold text. Court order in effect. All transfers suspended. Paul stood from his table. Your Honor. He addressed a woman 2 tables from him, the retired judge who had agreed to attend as a guest and to serve as a witness to the public record of the evening. The injunction is in effect as of 9 this morning. All documentation has been filed with the court and with the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario. The woman nodded. 4 people moved from different points in the room. Plain clothes. 2 OPP financial crimes officers who had been seated as guests. They approached Curtis first. Curtis Delacroix, the first officer said, you are under arrest for fraud, conspiracy to commit elder financial abuse, and breach of fiduciary duty in connection with matters in British Columbia and Ontario. He read the rights clearly, efficiently. Curtis said nothing. He went with them. The second officer approached Dr. Foss's direction. A man near the edge of the room stood slowly, his face blank. He had come to verify the evening's proceedings on behalf of the operation. He did not resist. Vanessa did not move. She sat at her table with her hands folded and stared at the tablecloth. My son walked to her table. He stood over her and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said in a very quiet voice, was any of it real? She didn't answer. He turned and walked to me. He put his arms around me and I held him the way I had when he was small and the world had frightened him. I'm sorry, Mum, he said into my shoulder. I'm so sorry. I held him tighter. You have nothing to be sorry for, I said. You loved someone. That's not a thing to be sorry for. He pulled back and looked at me. How did you know? How did you know what to do? I thought about Margaret in the bakery, turning off the light, taking my wrist in the dark. Someone looked out for us, I said. Someone who's known us long enough to care. The guests began to leave in clusters. Some stopped to embrace me. Some couldn't find words and simply touched my arm. My sister Marlene held me for a long time without saying anything, which was the right thing to do. Brenda walked with me to my car. The October air was cold and clean. The limestone building glowed behind us. You all right? She asked. I looked up at the sky. Robert had loved October skies. He said they were the most honest skies of the year. Nothing hiding in them. I will be, I said. She squeezed my hand. Robert would have been proud of you tonight. I didn't trust myself to answer that. I drove home alone. The house was dark when I pulled into the driveway. The white pine stood in the front yard, enormous now. Nothing like the sapling Robert had carried home from the nursery in the back of his truck. I went inside and made tea and sat at the kitchen table. At midnight, my phone buzzed. "My son, can I come over?" I typed back immediately. "The door is unlocked." He arrived 20 minutes later. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same chair Robert had used for 31 years. He was pale and his eyes were red, and he looked both older and younger than his 41 years. He told me what he knew and what he hadn't known, and where the lines between them had become unclear to him. He had believed the estate planning. He had believed when Vanessa raised the subject of my cognitive health that she was concerned. He had noticed things, small moments where her interest in the financial details of my estate seemed disproportionate, but he had told himself he was being uncharitable. He had loved her, and so he had explained away what he noticed. He told me that in July she had asked him what he thought about Birchwood Gardens. She had said she'd heard it was a lovely facility, that some families found it a relief when an aging parent was well cared for, and the family didn't have to worry. He had said that I was not at that stage. She had said of course not. She was just thinking ahead. He hadn't told me because he hadn't wanted to worry me, or because he hadn't wanted to look at what the question meant. "Why didn't you come to me?" I asked. He was quiet a long time. "Because I think I was afraid you'd ask me to choose. And I didn't know what I would have chosen." That was the most honest thing he could have said, and it cost him to say it. I reached across the table and covered his hand with mine. "You don't have to tell me the answer to that," I said, "and I won't ask." He looked up. "What I will tell you," I said, "is that your father chose this table. He chose this house and this yard and this family over every easier thing he could have had instead. He chose deliberately and every single day. That's what I want for you. Not a particular outcome, just the choosing." He nodded slowly. He didn't speak for a while. We sat together in the kitchen until past 2 in the morning, the way we had sometimes sat after Robert died, just keeping each other company in a house that still held the shape of him. 6 months passed. Winter came, and then a slow, wet spring, and then the first real warmth of June. Vanessa did not face criminal charges. The Crown prosecutor determined that while she had signed the Norwood Incorporation documents and participated in the planning, the evidence of her direct criminal intent was insufficient for the threshold required. She moved back to Calgary in January. My son did not contest this. He filed to end the engagement. The process was quiet and quick. Curtis Delacroix was charged with fraud and elder financial abuse in both Ontario and British Columbia. In April, he was convicted on 4 counts in Ontario and sentenced to 6 years in a federal institution. Audrey Sinclair's nephew, who had waited 3 years for this, sent me a card. It said only, "Thank you, we've been waiting." Dr. Gerald Foss had his medical license revoked by the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario in February. In May, he was convicted of fraud and falsifying medical records and sentenced to 4 years. At sentencing, Patricia Huang sat in the front row with her daughter. After the judge spoke, Patricia stood and read a statement. She spoke for 8 minutes. She did not raise her voice once. It was the most effective thing I have ever witnessed in a room. Patricia and I have had tea 3 times since November. She is funny and direct, and she knows more about rose cultivation than anyone I have ever met. Last month, she told me that the 2 years after what happened to her were the loneliest of her life because no one who hadn't lived it could understand it. I told her I thought I was beginning to understand it now. She said that was why she had come to the party. I had an independent cognitive assessment done in December at the University of Guelph's Geriatric Health Clinic. The report was 19 pages and concluded that my memory, reasoning, and executive function were well within the normal range for my age, which is 63, and consistent with someone a decade younger. I submitted it to the court file and to the College of Physicians and Surgeons. I gave a copy to Paul. I gave a copy to my son. Morrison Consulting, the cottage. The investment accounts. Everything Robert and I built is still here. In March, my son called to tell me he had started seeing someone. A civil engineer he had met through work. He was being careful, he said. He was taking it slowly. I'm glad, I said. Is she kind? He said yes. I told him that was the only thing that mattered. In April, Paul called to let me know that the College of Physicians and Surgeons had opened a formal review of 2 additional capacity assessments, Dr. Foss had filed in the previous 5 years. The families of those individuals were being contacted. I don't know yet what they will find. I hope they find what they need to find. I drive past Maple Creek Bakery every Thursday on my way to my garden club. I stop in every second week. Margaret always has a tea set aside for me before I reach the counter. Last month, she told me that she had been afraid I would be angry with her for not telling me sooner, for not calling me after the first time she overheard the conversation through the wall. I told her there was nothing to forgive, that she had done exactly what needed doing at exactly the moment it needed doing. She shook her head and said she should have acted sooner. I told her that most of us are trying to act in the right way, and sometimes the timing is not perfect, and sometimes we are afraid of getting it wrong, and that none of that changes what she did, which was look out for someone she had known for 23 years because that is what people do for each other when they have any courage at all. She cried a little. I pretended not to notice. I still go to the cottage every August. This year my son is coming for the last 2 weeks. He's never come for 2 full weeks before. He said he wanted to spend time there while I could still remember where we kept the spare paddles and which rock not to step on when you're coming in off the water. I told him I had no intention of forgetting anything anytime soon. He said, I know, Mum. I know that now. There is an oak table in my kitchen where Robert and I ate breakfast for 31 years, and where my son and I sat until 2 in the morning last October, not saying very much. I sit there every morning with tea and the radio and the cat, and I look out at the yard where the white pine is taller than the roofline now, and I think about what it means to protect something. Robert worked his whole life to build what we have. I spent 4 years after he died learning to carry it alone. I almost lost it, not to thieves in the night, but to people who had watched me carefully and decided that a woman living alone in a house too large for her was a problem to be solved for someone else's benefit. What I know now that I did not know then is this. The people most likely to exploit you are not strangers. They are people who have learned your routines, who know when you are most vulnerable, who understand what you love and have calculated its worth. They are counting on your willingness to trust. They are counting on you not wanting to make trouble. Make trouble. Tell your solicitor. Tell your doctor. Tell the neighbor who has known you long enough to notice when something is wrong. Tell the woman at the bakery who has been making your family's birthday cakes for 2 decades. Ask questions about every document placed in front of you. Every single one. The people who love you will not be offended. The people who are offended are telling you something. I am 63 years old. I live alone, and I intend to continue doing so for as long as I choose. I have a cottage on Georgian Bay and a white pine in my front yard, and a cat who does not appreciate being called a cat. I have a son who is learning to choose carefully, and a neighbor who showed up without asking why, and a retired nurse who reads victim impact statements without raising her voice, and a woman who bakes in a limestone building on the main street who saved my life by turning off a light and saying, "Listen, I am still here, and I am paying attention." If this story gave you something to think about, I would be so grateful if you left a comment and told me where you are watching from tonight. I love knowing how far these stories travel. And if someone in your life needs to hear this, please share it with them. You might be the person who turns off the light at exactly the right moment. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. There is something I have thought about many times since that Thursday afternoon in Margaret's bakery. I did not walk in there looking for the truth. I walked in to pick up a cake. The truth found me because someone who had known me for 23 years had the courage to turn off a light and say, "Listen, that is the first thing I want to say about what happened to me." Courage rarely announces itself. It does not always arrive in a dramatic moment when someone stands up in a crowded room. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in a back corner near a walk-in refrigerator, from a woman with flour on her apron who is afraid of getting it wrong but chooses to act anyway. Margaret was not certain. She was not trained for what she did. She simply refused to stay silent about something she knew was wrong. That decision, made in an ordinary moment in an ordinary week, changed the entire course of what followed. I think about Dorothy sitting in her car in the bakery parking lot with the cake on the passenger seat, hands on the wheel, engine off. That stillness was not weakness. It was the mind doing what the mind must do when it receives information that restructures everything it believed to be true. We do not give ourselves enough credit for those moments, the moments when we do not collapse, when we sit with something devastating and let it settle before we decide what to do next. That composure, that refusal to act from panic, is a form of intelligence that takes years to develop and that no one teaches you in any school. What Curtis and Vanessa did was calculated and patient. They understood that the most effective way to take something from a person is not to take it all at once, but to build, slowly, a version of reality in which the person comes to believe they need help. They studied Dorothy. They identified what she loved and what she feared, and they built a plan around both. This is not unique to her story. It happens to people who are sharp and present and paying attention, and it happens precisely because those people trust, because they have spent their lives building relationships worth trusting, and so they extend that habit to people who have not earned it. The answer to that is not to stop trusting. The answer is to stay curious, to ask questions about every document placed in front of you, to notice when someone is offended by a question, and ask yourself what that offense is protecting. Decent people do not become angry when you ask them to explain what you are signing. Decent people expect you to ask. The anger is information. What I carried away from this more than anything is the value of people who have known you long enough to notice. Paul Whitmore, who had handled 15 years of legal work. Brenda, who had lived next door for 27 years. Margaret, who remembered every birthday. These people held context about Dorothy that a stranger cannot hold. They knew what normal looked like. That knowledge is not sentimental. It is protective. It is worth tending. And Patricia Huang, who stood up at a party full of strangers and said her name and told the truth about what had happened to her, knowing it would cost her something to do so. She came because she had been through the dark alone and she was not willing to let someone else go through it the same way. That is what integrity looks like when it has been tested and survived, not a declaration. Just a woman standing up at the right moment because she understood what it meant to have no one stand up for you. Dorothy did not win because the universe corrected itself. She won because she made a phone call at 11 o'clock at night, because she asked hard questions, because she was willing to be the person who turns a celebration into something difficult in order to protect others beyond herself. That is a choice. It requires something, and she made it. Whatever you are protecting, protect it with your eyes open. Ask the questions, call the person, turn the light back on.